Today we are at the Law Library of the University of Minnesota talking with William H. Lindberg, who is currently the president of the Ash Grove Group Incorporated. Many of us, however, will remember Bill, as William prefers to be called, as an official of the Old West Publishing Company. Indeed, he held a number of successive senior leadership positions at the company before it was sold to the Thompson Group and became better known today perhaps as Thompson Writers to many of our newer colleagues. Bill, let's talk a little bit about yourself when you were young and your life perhaps then and today.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to do this, Pat, and I've had a lot of opportunity to reflect this summer about some of these issues in anticipation for our interview today. And I grew up in a fairly small town in northern Minnesota and went to college in Minnesota at St. Olaf College, and then after that to law school here at the University of Minnesota. And I suppose early on I had an interest in becoming a lawyer. I wasn't exactly sure where that would lead. After law school, immediately after law school, I participated in an exchange program in Denmark, and I'd always probably thought I wanted to be a trial lawyer, and I worked for a 350-year-old savings bank on this exchange program. And I suppose there's a connection with that, and ultimately finding my way to West Publishing Company. And so I was at West for some couple of years right out of law school. And then I left West to practice law for several years, and then returned to West, working on the law school side of things. Though I began as a statutes editor at West, and that was my first position. So that's a little bit of my background, and I was very, very happy to sort of find a path in the law that fit for me.
That sounds like the thing that happened to most of us in the field. I mean, we could have done the more traditional practice you did for a few years, but then that's not always for everybody. So you and I actually, in different parts of the continuum, as we call it, participated in the process of providing access to legal information to those who did need that, be they lawyers, judges, students, or whoever.
Absolutely. I think one of the questions that intrigued me was when people are presumed to know the law, how do they find the law and know what the law is? And as you know from our respective careers, that's sometimes simple and straightforward, and sometimes a very complicated path to understand what the law is in a particular matter, and increasingly how complex that has become as the way of accessing legal information.
That's right. Indeed, as you say, some people think that the law is something you just look up in one book. And we were negligent as librarians in not showing them that book, and you were negligent as a publisher, a publishing company, in not producing such a book, I guess, they would think. But you're quite right, it would not have been practical or possible even. Let's talk a little bit about your education. You mentioned you're a lawyer by training. You've got a law degree. Could you talk a little bit about your degrees?
Sure. My undergraduate degree was in political science, so the path often traveled by political science majors was to think about law school. And I, at one time, probably wanted to head in some capacity in an international dimension to law. And I've had a chance to do some work with international programs and some in law librarianship, even with the Law Library of Congress, and programs there when our colleague Kathy Price was there, and Rubens Medina. And at one point had an opportunity to go to Shanghai. So that path on the international side, in an unusual way, was fulfilled at West. But that's how I left law school, with a certain openness and receptivity to what might come along. And in retrospect, I'm very pleased that the West Publishing path was what opened up in the law for me.
Well, before we talk a little more about your experiences at West and so on, I'm very intrigued by what you are doing today.
Okay.
You are a certified master coach of the International Coach Federation.
Right.
And the Ash Grove group, through that, you participate in that kind of work, or you do that kind of work. Talk a little bit about that and what it is.
Sure.
Who uses it, that kind of thing.
I have been doing this work, it's hard to believe, for about 14 years, which is roughly 2/3 the length of time I worked at West. And it's been an interesting kind of second career for me. And it was, I thought I was after West when I left West, which was a big shift for me because so much of my identity had been connected with West. I discovered there was a program in Santa Barbara, California, a seminar called the Life Launch Seminar. And I thought I was going to do fundraising, which I did for a while for small nonprofits and so on. And I've been very active in Rotary International, so I've had some fundraising opportunity there. But what opened up and what emerged was all along my career, I suppose as a manager at West, I managed more in a coaching capacity, and I'd been resident advisor and dormitory counselor in college and law school. So I liked that element of advising, kind of in a sense the counseling side of law, though I did do some litigation. So this work has allowed me to follow a path where I created my own company, the Ash Grove Group, at which I'm a principal. And I subsequently moved to California. The program that I studied, it's roughly a master's level program in executive coaching, the Hudson Institute program in Santa Barbara, California. And so for 8 years I lived out there and taught both there and at the Fielding Graduate University, teaching executive coaching. But in a burst of exuberance after starting that program, I signed a 3-year lease on office space and founded the company known as the Ash Grove Group, which has been around now. It's in its 15th year as a Minnesota corporation. But several years into it, because of my connection with the Hudson Institute and a sense of adventure, I suppose, even though I was a lifelong Minnesotan, the West Coast beckoned. And so I lived in California for 8 years and recently returned to Minnesota. So I work with individuals and organizations now, and that's, I've worked with a number of law librarians and done strategic planning for both law libraries and law schools. I've worked with Fortune 50 companies and their executive teams, and I've worked with individuals along the way and small and mid-sized companies. So it's offered me a wonderful kind of panoramic view of fields other than legal publishing. Yet it's allowed me to stay close. Many of my clients, probably 40 to 50% of my clients at a given time, are law related, either lawyers going through career transition or wanting to enhance their effectiveness in some way, or deal with a blind spot that's getting in their way, and figuring out ways to change behaviors and so on. So it's been a very rewarding subsequent career to my time.
Sounds like people can really take advantage of that kind of focus training and enhance their own skills and ability to pursue their profession. As you say, many lawyers have taken advantage of it.
Right, and to be a lawyer these days, or to be in the law library, there are many challenges, whether that be business development, or whether that just be claiming an identity and branding yourself or your organization. And so usually it helps to have a sounding board or thought partner in that process, and that's what I've been doing.
Tremendous amount of change.
Absolutely.
One of them, of course, perhaps immediately ahead of the current era, although not many years ago, was the transformation of the legal publishing world, which included, among other things, the acquisition of the former West Publishing Company by the Thompson Writers Group, now as they're known. Could you talk a little bit about your involvement prior to that transformation? Because That's what we know of you. We remember
Right.
you, Bill, when you were, one of the people we'd always meet at the annual meetings and that kind of thing. And you were, one of the major representatives to us of the company.
Right, and it was a very interesting path that took and somewhat unexpected. As you say, the times, I started at West in 1974 and then practiced for a couple years after my first stint at West. And it was really about the time I returned, 1978, to the company that so much ferment was going on, both on the publishing side and then in the profession at large, and then in the field of law librarianship. So the mediums were changing, the information and content, and even in the larger legal profession. What began as a legal profession when I started, as I left West in 1997, there were more and more indications and references to the law business. And sort of the professional aspects were certainly shifting. They were still there, and there's a code of professional responsibility and model rules of conduct. But what was reflective of the field of law in general was also reflective within the company. So the observations I noticed was that I began on the print side. I was working in the law school department after my brief tenure in editorial. So much of my work was with academic institutions and law libraries as part of that. And so I would work on signing up authors and then promoting case books and horn books and nutshells, our product line at the time that I worked with. And then along the way, in 1981, my responsibilities shifted over to Westlaw. And so my first law library meeting that I attended was in 1981 in Washington. It was a very memorable meeting because it was at the Washington Hilton, and I was also working on a case book on law and American history by Stephen Presser and his co-author. And I had the opportunity to deliver a review copy of that book to the Chief Justice, at the time Chief Warren Berger, as part of the kind of work I did. But it was soon after that I shifted over to work with Westlaw, which was very much reflective of the shift in print to electronic resources. And there were also fiche resources along the way that was part of that change. But it was very interesting from my observation, and I guess every map maker draws a map with their country in the center of the map, is my understanding. So some of my comments today are from my vantage point and my point of observation. But that being the case, it was very interesting. I'd say for the 40 years or so before I had joined West was doing quite well in the marketplace, in its traditional marketplace. But what was changing was that there was a company in Ohio, derivative of the Ohio Bar project and then acquired by the Mead Paper Company, Mead Data Central, that began LexisNexis. So one way or another, West was at a crucial turning point in its decision process here. And the decision that was made, really spearheaded by newly installed President Dwight Opperman. He became president in 1968. And over some fierce opposition within the company because of the resources that it was going to take. And Mr. Opperman passed away this summer in June of 2013. So recently at the memorial service, there was a retrospective of some of these decisions. But it was very interesting the amount of resistance that was encountered. First of all, West began with headnotes only.
I remember
and
that.
there was a lot of resistance to the resources, company resources involved in the transition. And then two significant things happened in my observation. A college department, a college textbook department was begun in the early 70s, and also Westlaw was launched in the early and mid-70s. And it was a byproduct of the changing manufacturing technology and production technology of computer composition and so on. So there was a much more realistic and plausible way of capturing the data that was being published in print and then converting that such that it would be retrievable electronically. But it was very interesting about the span of time that really very little innovation was accomplished. But so anyway, as I talked about the map makers and their vantage point, as I became involved on the Westlaw side, I had several colleagues that were familiar to many law librarians, including Craig Rundy and others. Tom McLeod was also a mentor of mine. And in that process, Mead data had a significant market share. So we were really on the ropes, and we had to do something
Well,
dramatic.
they were just a few years ahead of you. As you say, they started with the OBAR project in Ohio, the Ohio Bar, digitalizing Ohio materials, and then began to expand from that state by state. And they were maybe 4 or 5 years ahead of you people.
They were, and they were aggressively marketing to law schools.
Well, they didn't have a traditional run of books like
Exactly.
you had. And
They
the
didn't.
track record of handling their business the same way for many years in the past quite successfully. They were
Right.
Totally new.
So, as I had indicated, in some ways, West had become complacent because it was doing so well efficiently and high-quality products
Sure.
on the book front. But there was this blindside force of a paradigm-changing technology happening. So that is interesting in terms of what happened next. I don't know the exact percentage of market share, but the LexisNexis database had a huge lead in terms of market share over West. And so it was really in the early 80s that the reality of that threat was very apparent to West's management. And so some very aggressive steps needed to be taken to get back in the ballgame in a significant way. So from my vantage point, one of the key things, and we can refer to this later, but was a program at the ALO meeting in San Diego. And we'll get a close-up of this brochure. But this was a program we entitled The Return of the Edai, which was based on Joseph Campbell mythology, portraying the West Publishing Company as the rebel alliance in its competitive battle with Mead Data Central. And the one advantage we had quite distinctly was the time advantage of our InstaCite citator service over AutoCite. So we did a very aggressive marketing effort at the San Diego meeting in 1984. And it was so uncharacteristic of West, because there was a time when West was very, very similar in some respects to IBM. Starched shirts and pinstripe suits. And for West to launch a program such as the Return of the Edai, with the endorsement of Mr. Opperman and the executive team, because it was hard to...
Obviously was a very visionary leader.
He was a very visionary leader in many ways, and much more so than some colleagues at the company. And it was the strength of that vision that allowed Westlaw to eventually succeed. So the follow-up to the Return of the Edai, because we kind of set a tradition, we had a major reception, as you know, and that was my participation.
Oh, I remember those.
One day a year, I was a non-bureaucrat and had the opportunity to step out with some other colleagues. So the following year, we went to New York City. And when we had the executive screening for the Return of the Edai, Mr. Opperman, because of its hard-hitting message, stood up and said, "Great show." And when Mr. Opperman stands up and says, "Great show," others are not inclined to disagree with that assessment. The next year, however, we were going to New York City. And we had a message to deliver that the Westlaw system and service worked quite well with West Books and complemented one another in terms of their approach. And all along the way, of course, system developments and enhancements are beginning to happen, and the full text nature of the system started to kick in. But we had this idea, again, I have to give Craig Rundy a lot of credit here, but we did a story about an epic love story between a book named Betty, West Modern Federal Practice Digest, and a computer named Walt, West's Automated Law Terminal, which has been named as a result of a naming competition by the law library staff at Berkeley. So when we had the executive screening for the epic love story between a book named Betty and a computer named Walt, where we'd hire many of the staff people for Prairie Home Companion, and each character had a theme song. Betty Book was a bluegrass song, and Craig, dressed up as the Walt computer, was a synthesizer music, and ultimately, of course, the two married, and that was our marketing message. But when we had the executive screening for this show, Mr. Opperman did not get up and say, "Great show." The room was stone cold silent. You could have heard a pin drop. And at the time, I recall my boss and his boss sitting toward the rear of the room in case this one wasn't going to work out so much. I suspect that was Bill Lindberg's show at that point. But it took an effort, and we knew our audience and knew our colleagues and would appreciate our effort at humor, as well as the marketing message of what we were in the marketplace, how we were complimenting, and we would produce horn books, for example, with Westlaw references, search references. So this was really part of all that. But I think, as much as anything, and I've had many years now to think about this, the combination of the return of the Ed-I and the annual events that we started doing with some creativity and flair, including the year we had Richard Dysart and the LA Law theme in Atlanta, was really unleashing kind of a generational creativity that was ready to pop at West. So it wasn't just me or Craig or others around us, but I think that whole generation, and also supplemented by the 4-color textbooks produced by the college department, that there was change afoot throughout the company. And the company began to, again, under executive guidance and sponsorship, embrace this change as opposed to resist the change, and appreciate that the world was changing. And I think there were many core values at West, and my firsthand experience, I stayed a year after the acquisition by the Thompson Company, but the core value at West was really about tradition and respect, deference to the past and tradition and so on. And Thompson's key core value had to do with change. And both, of course, are quite valid in the world as we know it. And so there was so much change soon after the acquisition. And I think Thompson began to put its brand on the company and its product line. But I can't really comment too much other than just to notice it's not limited to the legal publishing industry, but the forces of globalization, the forces of accelerating change and volatility in all kinds of marketplaces and all kinds of dimensions. And I think in 1994, when the sale of Mead Data, ultimately acquired by Reed Elsevier, happened, and LexisNexis, and as well as other smaller publishers who were putting out economical products that didn't have as many bells as whistles as LexisNexis and Westlaw, that there were major changes happening there. And of course, more recently, the Bloomberg company has gotten into the fray, and so it's very interesting to see how this is unfolding. And a few years ago, this was an attempt at a give back to the law library profession that was so generous to me, because it was really the people and the profession who were good friends and colleagues. Judith Wright, the director at the University of Chicago, and I, about 2010 or 11, did a program about a World Cafe program about the future of academic law librarianship, appreciating so many things were changing. And the relationship between accreditation of law schools, for example, and just the way the dynamics were shifting in firms between space allocation of print libraries, shifting more and more to electronics. It was just a fascinating array of changes that happened very much during those later stages of my time, and then beyond. It's even accelerated further, is my sense.
You know, you've talked about the leadership of Mr. Opperman, Dwight Opperman, and then his son, Vance,
Mm-hmm.
who you didn't mention, but obviously took the reins at that
Right.
point. You know, and it causes me to think about some other well-established companies that do not survive to today, whereas West does, even perhaps
Mhm.
as Thomson Reuters. Their executives didn't see it the same way that Dwight did.
Mhm.
That there was a future that was different from the past. They thought the future was the past.
Right.
Same thing. I'm thinking specifically of the former American Telephone and Telegraph Company,
Mhm.
AT&T. Today's AT&T is somebody that bought the name
Right.
and uses it. But in the early 80s, when the Justice Department forced the breakup of the old telephone monopoly and the spin-off of the regional companies from the central mother company, I guess you could call it,
Mhm.
Ma Bell, they called it.
Ma Bell.
The executives at Ma Bell, AT&T, thought that the future was in continuing to provide long-distance service.
Mhm.
And they opted for that and spun off the local phone companies. And that's where the business all went, was local. Long distance is now, it's a whole different kind of thing than in those days, where everything had to go over a single pair of copper wires, no matter how
Right.
far. And there were only so many, and you charged accordingly. And now with fiber optic and other digital technologies, life is just different. And the company literally didn't move with the times and went away.
Right.
West
Well-
could have done that if it had been under a different kind of leadership. But
I think so, and I think vision is a big part of that, and you had mentioned Vance coming in for several years
Yeah.
afterwards, and I think Vance was very much involved in a national stage and international stage even, and so things were changing and needing to do what was best ultimately for the company through fiduciary duty. That's the conclusion that was reached.
Mhm. Well, you worked with others at the company, and specifically I'm thinking of Roger Noreen. I think you've characterized him as a mentor, correct in that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about Roger and perhaps any others that
Sure.
played a major role? And
Well, I think Roger probably was my most critical mentor at the company because I worked closely with him in joining the company, and first on the print side, and then also with Westlaw and the Center for Computer Assisted Legal Instruction, Cali. Roger was instrumental, and West was one of the co-sponsors along with IBM of the Cali group that started. And Roger also he was quite traditional in some respects, but also saw that the world was changing. He was very closely in touch with customers and closely in touch with law library colleagues and law professors, as well as the practicing bar. And Roger had been a Republican legislator from Duluth, Minnesota for about 10 years in the Minnesota legislature after an initial time with West where he and Violet, his wife, who was a librarian, traveled around the country doing the lectures for West. And I later took on that role, describing the many features of the United States Code, annotated and corpus juris secundum. And so I was able to learn not only from Roger, but Owen Schaefer and others in the law school department. But Roger was very pragmatic in his sense, and we commissioned, when Roger retired, a caricature of Roger, and we'll get a close-up shot on this. But Roger was a colleague and a dear friend. He was
and an Eagle Scout, I
and
see
an
there.
Eagle Scout and legislator, so I think he had a pragmatism about his choices in terms of when it would come time to sign up an author or publish a book. He would listen carefully to really good advice. We had several advisory boards at West, and those were invaluable, both on the print side and helped with the connection at signing authors and the sort of network at the time. And then the Westlaw Advisory Board, which I was very much involved in, and Roger as well, and Tom McLeod. We had both an academic advisory board and a law firm and government type advisory board. And the advice that we received both on features and the marketplace and trends in the marketplace were very important. So what I learned from Roger had been a long time executive at West, was a vice president and on the board of directors. But a couple of the mottos at West were forever associated with the practice of law and better service to the bench and bar.
Mhm.
And Roger had a couple of roles in addition to his vice president, manager of the law school department role. He was the liaison with the law librarians group.
Mhm.
And I was very fortunate for a time to have inherited that role from him and received guidance and mentoring in how Roger would do things. But whether it was a matter of selling one nutshell or a very large textbook adoption, what I learned from Roger was that the service of the company to the customer was of utmost importance. And there were many Rogerisms. He would always, one story that occurs to me that had a lot to go attend it was, he said, well, you can have the greatest dog food in the world, but if the dogs don't like it, you're not going to get very far. So he was very much appreciating the importance of providing good service and value to customers in a way that they would want to subscribe or buy our product. So those are some of the lessons that I learned from Roger, but mostly he had high integrity. And I think for all the traveling I did to schools and within the bench and bar in Minnesota, I never heard an ill word about Roger. And amongst a clientele such as lawyers or professors, that's quite a feat to be in business that long and command that level of respect from people. So I was very fortunate to be mentored by a person of those values and integrity. And during some difficult times, not to put a gloss on it, there were some very challenging years in the 90s particularly, and in subsequent to the West Lexus litigation over what the extent of West's copyright was and the star paging initiatives and whether those were something to be endorsed or opposed. And it was very challenging times to kind of be caught in the middle of that. But I often tried my best to channel Roger and what Roger would do and just realize that my personal reputation and the company's reputation in this was very important, and there would be something coming out of the other end after some of these crunch issues were battled out.
You know, it's interesting, you talk about the litigation and so on that was occurring. That, from my understanding, was very new to the legal publishing business. I mean, it was, when I first became a law librarian, it was a very different world, it seemed, for legal publishing. There was West, and there was Lawyers Cooperative, and then there were a variety of other companies, and every one of them sort of, they produced products that complemented each other, fit together. I mean, one hears of a so-called gentleman's agreement back perhaps in the around 1940 or thereabouts, where they sort of divvied it up and somehow the Justice Department let it happen. But the reality was it was a much more collegial world, it seemed, from my perspective, among the publishers. They didn't badmouth each other. They you know, their products required access to products of other companies, and to some extent. That began to change in the 70s when LexisNexis came along and took West basically on head on with a truly competitive or potentially truly competitive product. And of course, the changes that you've talked about at the company in response built Westlaw to, and then the two have become sort of the modern era of publishing. But you know, when I was first out of law school back in the mid to late 60s, there were like 250, 300,000 lawyers totally in the United
Right.
States. And within not too many years after that, there were well over 1 million. And, the market must have grown considerably for law publications. And there was more money being made, and there were more opportunities, and it's probably not surprising that others decided that, this is something we want to be part of, and suddenly you do have new kinds of competition and
Right.
new ways of doing business. And one time I talked with a group, I was doing some consulting with a major law firm, and I said, at the time, I said, the way business is being done seems to be changing, and even West, and you had a very well-established reputation, is beginning to change how it has to do business. And that truly seemed to be what was occurring and what I thought I was seeing.
Well, and that refers to that 40-year interlude from, say, the mid-30s to the 70s. It really was a different time. And I think Tom Paxton wrote a song, I can't remember what year it was written, but he said in 10 years there was going to be 1 million lawyers. That certainly came to fruition. And from when I finished law school in 1973, I think the figure I'd heard was 350,000 lawyers. And whether that was ABA members or I think all lawyers. And then now that's certainly eclipsed that, and so many law school graduates occur each year. But I think what happened was that there were some very aggressive marketing moves, and it was perceived by West that the initiative that Lexis was undertaking was they're wanting the entire marketplace, or
I would imagine that would have been a criteria they would love to achieve.
Well, and again, our oral history doesn't really talk about antitrust so much, but in any event, the climate was such that the perception of they're out to eat our lunch, basically, and we're not going to let that happen. So those that are in a favorable market position don't relinquish that favorable market position voluntarily.
Certainly not.
This is where litigation comes from. And I think it was interesting because during the early 80s, the kind of complacency that West had about its reign from the 30s to the 70s, I think some of that complacency was attached to Lexis. Because there was a time in the early 80s where they, with a very significant lead, I think got complacent and said, well, we have this ramped up and wrapped up. And so it was at that time West began to get much more parity and eventually, I think, superiority in the law school side of adoption and usage. And you would have student representatives at law schools and computer training centers staffing those. And so winning the hearts and minds of law students so that the preference they emerged from law school with would later generate billable usage was a very important strategy. And the federal courts contract shifted from LexisNexis to West in the early to mid-80s. And so all of a sudden there was then a wake-up call. And that was when the litigation, the West Mead litigation occurred, and that was ultimately settled. And then things tended to calm down. But that competition was intense all along the way. And it was exciting. It was very heady times, whether you were a consumer or one of the providers. You had to stay on your toes just to stay even, was the sense.
As a consumer, people like myself relished some of the opportunities that it gave us. For example, in those days, we couldn't get the funds to put in computers for students.
Right.
But the two companies provided computers. And the idea was that their computers would be used for their particular database, but the students were creative at figuring out how to use it for other things too.
Right. So there were a lot of negotiations in those days. So it sharpened my negotiation skills.
And then you all came in with offline printers so that suddenly the students could have what they really wanted, which was a paper copy of what they found digitally. And of course that put an end to the profits in the photocopy business that many of us had, but the advantages were consider also, life's full of trade-offs. But,
Right. So those were big issues, and whether to allow home access, and concern
I
about
remember that, yes.
whether students who were clerks would do this on their academic program. So we had an elaborate licensing program that both schools and students would agree to, and ultimately.
I remember certain less than fully scrupulous lawyers would hire a student in law school and basically tell them to go find it on whatever database.
Exactly. So those were the concerns that we knew were out there, but so it was a trade-off of trying to supply access to students and so on, but also protect our revenue streams, which shouldn't be profited by copyright infringement or
I mean, you can't
ignoring
afford to stay in
license
business with all
Exactly.
the costs of doing it if you give away the product or have
Exactly.
to have it stolen from you. I mean,
So those were exciting times,
Mhm.
and trying to win hearts and minds was really a role that I had, and it was one that provided many enduring friendships and relationships. And then after I left the company, the globalization and database offerings continued to expand exponentially with international materials and regulatory materials, briefs, just an amazing array.
It's interesting. I, of course, now been retired for 10 years, and I live well away from the law library in which I worked, or any other really close, although we have a fairly good state law library nearby. But I sit in my den with the computer, and I have access to information that I would have killed to have that kind of access to, even in the heyday of my career. I mean, it just wasn't there. It's all digital, it all comes in. I have, as a professor emeritus, access to the databases, to the university's licenses for West and Lexis. And,
So it's a pretty sweet world, being
It
in
really
the
is.
Pacific Northwest and having that array of information available.
Yeah.
That's a pretty
Yeah,
nice combination.
And of course, companies like Hein Online puts out things that complement that in good ways, and I have that, and it's been fabulous to have these sorts of resources. And do I need any bookcases in the room? Well, I do have a couple of them, but mostly for old time's sake.
For aesthetics,
Look up
presumably.
and see the books I used in my career, some of them, or used in my teaching.
Right, right. Not long ago, I saw a New Yorker cover of a bookstore, and it showed the bookstore with many knickknacks and other tchotchkes and items, and a small 4-foot section of books in the bookstore. And so this seems to be the way things are going, but personally, I still have a personal library that I'm trying to manage. But one of my roles, having downsized from a home to a condominium, is what to do about this library. And so I'm trying to find a good home for these volumes.
Not only do they take shelf space, but shelf space that requires a fair amount of load bearing.
Absolutely.
Hopefully the building is well constructed.
I asked that question before we went in, absolutely.
Good. I remember also as a consumer one concern that I and many of my colleagues had, and that was in the marketing of the databases. The law schools were, as you already alluded, perceived as a source of potential future users and paying customers of those databases. So you gave us access to them at, shall we say, token cost. I think that would be real.
Less than market rate, for sure.
Certainly under market rate. And one of the concerns I had is, as I saw us becoming more and more addicted to that technology, our students, wanting to find it on their screens, as I think they obviously do today, instead of hunting in the stacks for a book, and worrying that someday you guys might decide, you and the other companies, that there was no longer a need to seed the market of the future that way and start charging us what this service was really worth. And I had enough trouble getting budgets for other things, and I worried about if I'd dare have her go back in and tell the budget people that I needed a tremendous shall we say, financial increase just to cover the subscriptions that were going up. And it
Right.
never happened, but,
Right, it didn't during my era, and I can't speak to that now, but I think some of those realities or some of the direct causal link between law students landing in a position where they're going to pay at a significant rate,
sure.
I'm not sure those forces exist anywhere near the same way they did during kind of a golden era, if you will.
Yeah, it really was in many ways a golden era. You put your finger right on it. I mean, I saw it that way, my colleagues did, and the companies were giving us this fantastic new line of products and literally giving it to us almost. And we were allowed to experiment, learn how to use it in ways that the real world probably didn't have. And it was absolutely, as you say, a golden era.
I think it was, and not to be overly romanticizing the era, it was a time of expansionist thinking within the world of law and legal services that were provided and so on. And the commercial sort of aspects of that all worked out favorably. And in today's world, it's a different world where sometimes resources are scarce, and there isn't this expansiveness that we experienced during that earlier time.
Well, Bill, as we near the end of our conversation today, is there anything that we've not discussed that comes to mind that you'd like to bring up?
I think we've covered a good share of at least my vantage point and take on some of these issues. But again, my personal relationships that I developed with colleagues over the years were a wonderful way to live and work in a professional setting. And I had an opportunity to travel and meet colleagues across the country and some cases beyond at some of the meetings. And it was a lot of fun in those days as well as hard work. And I think that was very gratifying, and to have some role in that was very special to me.
Well, I want to thank you, Bill Lindberg, not only on my behalf, but also on behalf of Michelle Wu and Frank Hodak and Dick Spinelli, with whom I have the opportunity and honor to be working on developing this oral history of law librarianship for the Spinelli's Law Library Shelf portion of Hein Online.
All
Thank
right.
you for being part of it.
Absolutely, my pleasure.